In September 1990, a young woman lay dying on the side of a road in Oklahoma City. She had been struck by a vehicle while walking with a man and a small child. To the people who rushed to help her, it appeared to be a tragic hit and run. She was taken to the hospital where doctors fought to save her life. Despite their efforts, she died 2 days later. The man who claimed to be her husband identified her as Tanya Hughes. He appeared devastated. Friends described her as kind, intelligent, and devoted to her young son. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual about the case. A young mother had lost her life in a terrible accident. Her family would mourn. Her husband would raise their son. Life, however painful, would move forward. But almost immediately, small details began to unravel that story. The people who had known Tanya realized they knew almost nothing about her past. No childhood photographs surfaced. No relatives came forward. Records that should have existed could not be found. Even her name seemed to lead nowhere. What began as an ordinary traffic investigation slowly transformed into something far darker. Investigators discovered that the woman everyone knew as Tanya Hughes had spent years living behind a carefully constructed identity. The man who claimed to love her had told different versions of the same story to different people. Nothing about his past remained consistent. Every answer uncovered another question. As detectives dug deeper, they found themselves following a trail that stretched across multiple states and several decades. Missing children, false identities, kidnappings, sexual abuse, murder. Each discovery revealed another layer of deception. The case became one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in modern American history, not because of a single crime, but because of how many lives had been hidden beneath a web of lies. For years, one victim had no true name, one child had vanished without a trace, and one man had managed to disappear behind dozens of stolen identities while leaving devastation wherever he went. This is the true story behind the woman once known only as the girl in the picture. For the people who knew her in Oklahoma City, she was simply Tanya Hughes. She was quiet, polite, and hardworking. Friends described her as someone who rarely drew attention to herself. She smiled easily, treated people with kindness, and devoted nearly every moment outside of work to her young son, Michael. To everyone around her, she appeared to be an ordinary young mother trying to build a better life. By the late 1980s, Tanya had settled into a routine. She worked at a local nightclub called Passions, where coworkers remembered her as dependable and professional. Despite working long hours, she never seemed to lose sight of what mattered most to her. Michael was the center of her life. Friends often saw the two together. She dressed him neatly, cared for him attentively, and spoke constantly about wanting him to have opportunities she had never experienced. Those who knew her believed she was doing everything possible to give her son a stable future. But there was another constant presence in her life, a man who called himself Clarence Hughes. Clarence introduced himself as Tanya's husband and Michael's father. He was considerably older than Tanya, quiet by nature, and generally avoided drawing attention to himself. At first glance, nothing about the family appeared unusual, yet many people who knew them remembered an uncomfortable feeling whenever Clarence was around. He closely monitored Tanya's movements. He frequently appeared without warning at her workplace. He seemed uncomfortable whenever she developed friendships with other people. Several co-workers later recalled seeing bruises on Tanya. Whenever someone asked what had happened, she dismissed the injuries with simple explanations. She had fallen. She had bumped into something. It was nothing serious. Few people questioned her further. At the time, they assumed they were witnessing the struggles of a troubled relationship. No one imagined they were looking at only a small part of a much larger story. There was something else about Tanya that puzzled those closest to her. She almost never spoke about her past. She rarely mentioned where she had grown up. She never talked about parents or siblings. No relatives ever visited. No childhood friends appeared. There were no family photographs decorating her home. When conversations turned toward childhood memories, Tanya usually smiled politely before changing the subject. Most people assumed she simply valued her privacy. Looking back, those silences became some of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Then on the evening of September 28, 1990, everything changed. Tanya, Clarence, and 4-year-old Michael were walking along Southeast 59th Street in Oklahoma City. As they attempted to cross the roadway, a pickup truck struck Tanya before continuing down the road without stopping. Witnesses rushed to help. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Tanya critically injured. She had suffered devastating head trauma and multiple broken bones. Clarence escaped with relatively minor injuries. Michael was physically unharmed. Emergency responders transported Tanya to the hospital where doctors fought to save her life. For 2 days, friends and co-workers hoped she would recover. On September 30th, 1990, those hopes ended. 20-year-old Tanya Hughes died from her injuries. Her death was ruled the result of injuries sustained in the traffic collision. The driver had fled the scene, and investigators initially treated the case as a fatal hit-and-run. At that moment, nothing suggested the tragedy was connected to anything more than a reckless driver. Police concentrated on identifying the vehicle and locating the person responsible. Meanwhile, Clarence Hughes identified Tanya's body and made arrangements following her death. To everyone around him, he appeared to be a grieving husband. Friends gathered to mourn. Co-workers struggled to understand how someone so young could lose her life so suddenly. Their greatest concern quickly became Michael. The little boy had lost the only parent he appeared to know. Most people assumed Clarence would continue raising him. But as the days passed, another mystery quietly emerged. Authorities attempting to complete the routine paperwork surrounding Tanya's death encountered unexpected problems. Hospitals, funeral officials, and investigators all relied on official records to verify a person's identity and notify surviving relatives. In Tanya's case, those records seemed strangely incomplete. Clarence told investigators that Tanya had been born in Texas. He provided personal details about their lives together and identified Michael as their son. Initially, there was little reason to doubt his account, but when authorities attempted to verify the information, they found remarkably little evidence documenting Tanya's life before she arrived in Oklahoma. There were no readily identifiable childhood records. No relatives came forward after news of her death. No close family friends contacted investigators. The woman everyone knew as Tanya Hughes seemed to have appeared in Oklahoma without leaving any trace of the years that came before. To investigators, it was unusual, but not necessarily suspicious. Some people became estranged from their families, others intentionally left difficult pasts behind. The inconsistencies were noted but did not immediately trigger a broader criminal investigation. As police continued searching for the driver responsible for the collision, Clarence quietly assumed custody of Michael. Then, almost as suddenly as he had entered the lives of those around him, he disappeared. Within a short time after Tanya's funeral, Clarence withdrew Michael from the community they had known. Friends who attempted to contact them discovered they had moved away. Phone numbers no longer worked, addresses changed. Eventually, no one knew where either of them had gone. To those left behind, the disappearance felt unsettling. But without evidence of a crime beyond the traffic collision, there was little authorities could do. In time, the investigation into the hit-and-run reached its conclusion. The driver responsible was eventually identified. The evidence showed that the collision had been exactly what investigators had initially believed: a tragic traffic accident caused by a driver who fled the scene. There was no evidence that Tanya had been deliberately targeted. Her death itself was not the result of a murder plot. Yet while the collision proved accidental, investigators would later realize that almost everything surrounding Tanya's life had been built on deception. The accident had accomplished something no one could have predicted. It forced authorities to examine the identity of a young woman who had spent years living under a name that did not seem to belong to her. As the paperwork surrounding her death was reviewed, more inconsistencies surfaced. Her childhood could not be verified. Her family remained absent. The records expected to accompany an ordinary life simply did not exist. The woman buried as Tanya Hughes appeared to have no history before adulthood. At the time, those unanswered questions faded into the background. The case was considered closed, friends mourned, life moved on. But buried beneath the official reports was a mystery waiting to be uncovered. Who was Tanya Hughes? Where had she come from? And why did no one seem to know the woman everyone believed they had known? Years later, those very questions would bring investigators back to Oklahoma. What began as a routine investigation into a fatal traffic accident would slowly transform into one of the most extraordinary identity investigations in Americans' criminal history. The search for the truth had only just begun. For nearly 4 years after Tanya Hughes's death, the unanswered questions surrounding her identity remained buried beneath the official record of a fatal traffic accident. The driver responsible for the collision had been identified, and the case itself was considered closed. To most people, the story had ended, but for one man, something never felt right. Frank Cottam, the principal of Briarwood Elementary School in Oklahoma City, had known Michael during his time at the school. He remembered the little boy as bright, polite, and deeply attached to his mother. After Tanya's death, Michael suddenly disappeared. Clarence Hughes withdrew him from school without much explanation, and neither he nor the child was ever seen in Oklahoma again. Years passed, but Cottam could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. In 1994, he contacted authorities, asking them to make sure Michael was safe. That single phone call reopened a case many believed had already reached its conclusion. The investigation was assigned to agents with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. At first, detectives expected a straightforward welfare check. Instead, they found themselves confronting an extraordinary mystery. Clarence Hughes had vanished. The address where he had lived was vacant. Neighbors did not know where he had gone. Employment records ended abruptly. Every attempt to locate him reached a dead end. As investigators began reviewing the information he had provided after Tanya's death, inconsistencies quickly emerged. Official records failed to support many of the details Clarence had given about himself. Some documents appeared genuine, others could not be verified at all. The deeper detectives looked, the more they began to suspect that Clarence Hughes was not his real name. That realization changed the direction of the investigation. If Clarence had lied about who he was, investigators had to ask an even more troubling question. Had he also lied about Tanya? Agents expanded their inquiry, examining birth records, marriage documents, school files, driver's licenses, social security records, and every official document connected to Tanya Hughes. Again, they encountered the same disturbing pattern. Almost nothing could be verified. There was no consistent record of her childhood, no confirmed parents, no relatives, no traceable history before she appeared as a young adult. Experienced investigators knew that even people who changed their names usually left behind some form of paper trail: school enrollment, medical records, family photographs, employment histories. Tanya Hughes seemed to have none of them. The woman everyone believed they knew appeared to have no documented life before adulthood. As detectives continued searching for Clarence Hughes, another discovery transformed the investigation. The man they were looking for was not Clarence Hughes at all. His real name was Franklin Delano Floyd. For investigators, it was the first confirmed piece of truth in a case dominated by deception. Once Floyd's true identity became known, detectives began reconstructing his past. What they uncovered revealed a criminal history stretching back decades. Born in 1943, Floyd had spent much of his adult life moving from one state to another, repeatedly adopting false identities whenever his past threatened to catch up with him. His criminal record began with theft and robbery before escalating dramatically. In 1963, Floyd was convicted in Georgia of kidnapping and rape. He served years in prison. For many offenders, imprisonment marks the end of a criminal career. For Floyd, it proved only a temporary interruption. After his release, he resumed a life built on deception. He drifted across the United States. He forged documents. He assumed new identities. He changed names whenever necessary. To neighbors, he might appear to be an ordinary laborer. To employers, a dependable worker. To acquaintances, a devoted family man. Every version of himself was carefully constructed. Very few people ever knew who he really was. Long before computerized databases connected law enforcement records nationwide, Floyd exploited the weaknesses of the system: a different driver's license, a different social security number, a different surname. Each new identity allowed him to leave his past behind. As investigators pieced together his movements, another disturbing pattern emerged. Wherever Floyd settled, there always seemed to be a young girl or young woman living under his control. The relationship he described depended entirely on the audience. Sometimes he introduced the girl as his daughter. Other times he claimed she was his wife. The explanation changed whenever it suited him. Witnesses who had known Tanya years earlier began providing statements that would later become critically important. Several recalled meeting her when she was still a teenager. At that time, Floyd had introduced her as his daughter. Teachers remembered a quiet, intelligent student who earned excellent grades but rarely discussed her home life. She avoided talking about her family. She never invited classmates to her house. She seemed isolated from other students. Then, as the years passed, Floyd abruptly changed the story. The same young woman he had once presented as his daughter was now introduced as his wife. Few people questioned the contradiction because most had never known the earlier version of the story. For investigators, however, the implications were deeply disturbing. It suggested that Floyd had deliberately manipulated the identities of those closest to him for years. Friends and co-workers in Oklahoma also began recalling details they had once dismissed as private family matters. They remembered bruises on Tanya. They remembered how nervous she became whenever Floyd appeared unexpectedly. Some recalled conversations suggesting she wanted greater independence but seemed frightened of how Floyd might react. Taken individually, none of those observations proved a crime. Together, they painted a picture of coercive control. As detectives expanded their investigation, they also began examining Michael's origins. Floyd had always claimed to be the boy's biological father. Modern forensic testing revealed otherwise. DNA analysis conclusively established that Franklin Delano Floyd was not Michael's biological father. The discovery disproved yet another central claim Floyd had repeated for years. The identity of Michael's biological father has never been publicly established. For investigators, that unanswered question reinforced a growing belief. Nothing Floyd had said about his family could be accepted without independent verification. The investigation was no longer focused solely on a mysterious death. It had become an effort to uncover decades of hidden crimes. Detectives reviewed rental agreements, employment records, prison files, foster care documents, and witness statements from multiple states. Former neighbors described a man who frequently moved before anyone became too curious about his past. Co-workers remembered someone who revealed very little about himself. Every relocation erased another piece of his history. Every false identity concealed another chapter of deception. Authorities eventually located Floyd in Kentucky and arrested him in 1994. With him was Michael. For the first time since Tanya's death, investigators knew the little boy was alive. It was a major breakthrough, yet they still could not answer the most fundamental question: who had Tanya Hughes really been? As Floyd's criminal history became clearer, detectives realized that solving the case depended on identifying the young woman whose past had apparently been erased. They revisited missing person reports from across the country. Thousands of files were examined. Old photographs were compared with images of Tanya as both a teenager and a young adult. Families searching for daughters who had disappeared decades earlier were contacted. The process was painstaking. Many promising leads ultimately proved unrelated, but investigators refused to stop. Somewhere in those forgotten records, they believed, was the true identity of the woman Floyd had spent years hiding. The answer would not come from another witness, nor would it come from Floyd himself. Instead, it would come through advances in forensic science. DNA technology was transforming cold case investigations across the United States, identifying victims who had remained unknown for decades. Investigators hoped it could accomplish what years of traditional detective work could not. They submitted biological samples preserved after Tanya's death for renewed forensic analysis. If science could reveal her identity, it would finally expose the life Franklin Delano Floyd had spent decades trying to erase. The investigation was now approaching its most important breakthrough. The woman buried as Tanya Hughes had a real name, a real family. And somewhere beyond decades of lies was a little girl who had disappeared long before anyone in Oklahoma had ever met the quiet young mother they thought they knew. By the time investigators had uncovered Franklin Delano Floyd's true identity, the case had become far more than an investigation into the death of a young woman. It had evolved into two separate mysteries that were deeply connected. The first was the identity of the woman buried under the name Tanya Hughes. The second was the disappearance of her young son, Michael. Both questions pointed back to the same man. After Floyd's arrest in Kentucky in 1994, authorities immediately focused on Michael's welfare. The 6-year-old had spent nearly his entire life under Floyd's control. Following Floyd's arrest, state officials determined that Michael should no longer remain in his custody while the legal proceedings continued. Michael was placed with a foster family in Oklahoma. For the first time, he appeared to have an opportunity to experience a stable childhood. Teachers described him as bright, polite, and affectionate. Those caring for him believed that with patience and support, he might finally begin recovering from years of instability. That hope would last only a matter of months. On the morning of September 12, 1994, Michael arrived at his elementary school in Choctaw, Oklahoma, just as he had on previous school days. Parents were dropping off their children. Teachers were preparing their classrooms. Nothing appeared unusual. Then, without warning, a vehicle entered the school grounds. Witnesses watched as a man approached Michael. Within seconds, he produced a handgun, forced the frightened child into his vehicle, and drove away before anyone could stop him. The entire kidnapping unfolded in broad daylight. School staff immediately contacted law enforcement. The suspect was identified almost at once. It was Franklin Delano Floyd. Only a short time earlier, he had been released on bond while legal proceedings involving Michael's custody continued. Rather than accepting the court's decision, Floyd had returned to reclaim the child by force. A nationwide manhunt began. Federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies coordinated an intensive search. Roadblocks were established. Vehicles matching witness descriptions were tracked. Every reported sighting was investigated. For days, investigators followed leads across several states. Then, on September 23, 1994, federal agents located Floyd in Louisville, Kentucky. He surrendered without resistance. Michael was not with him. From that moment, the investigation entered a new phase. Detectives questioned Floyd repeatedly. Where was Michael? Was he alive? Had someone else taken him? Each interview produced different answers. Sometimes Floyd claimed he had left the child with strangers. On other occasions, he suggested Michael had been placed with a family that wanted to adopt him. Later, he implied the boy was alive somewhere under another identity. None of those claims could be verified. Investigators carefully followed every lead. Every one of them reached a dead end. The inconsistencies convinced detectives that Floyd was deliberately concealing the truth. As the search for Michael continued, investigators also returned to the unanswered questions surrounding Tanya Hughes. The woman who had died in Oklahoma still had no documented past, no verifiable childhood, no biological relatives, no records explaining who she had been before adulthood. Traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. Witnesses had been interviewed, old records had been reviewed. Public appeals had generated thousands of tips. Families from across the United States contacted authorities, believing the unidentified woman might be their missing daughter or sister. Every possibility was examined. One by one, they were eliminated. Years passed with little progress. Then advances in forensic science began changing the way cold cases were investigated. DNA analysis had become increasingly sophisticated. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades were finally being resolved through biological evidence. Investigators believed the same technology might finally identify the woman known as Tanya Hughes. Biological samples preserved after her death were submitted for renewed forensic analysis. Specialists developed a complete DNA profile and began comparing it with reference samples from families of long-missing children. The process required extraordinary patience. Unlike modern investigative databases, there was no instant search capable of identifying unknown victims. Each comparison had to be carefully verified. Potential matches appeared before being ruled out. Months became years. The list of possibilities gradually narrowed. Then came the breakthrough investigators had spent years pursuing. One comparison revealed a close biological relationship with members of the Sevakis family. Additional testing was performed to eliminate any possibility of error. Independent laboratories reached the same conclusion. The evidence was definitive. The woman buried as Tanya Hughes had never been Tanya Hughes. Her real name was Suzanne Marie Sevakis. More than 20 years after her death, investigators had finally restored her identity. The discovery transformed the entire investigation. Attention shifted from the young woman Floyd had claimed as his wife to the little girl she had once been. Investigators reconstructed Suzanne's earliest years through court records, foster care files, and interviews with surviving family members. Suzanne had been born in 1969. She grew up with her mother, Sandra Wilcox, and several siblings. In 1975, after Sandra received a short prison sentence for a financial offense, her children were temporarily placed into foster care. Before Sandra could regain custody, Franklin Delano Floyd appeared, claiming to be the children's biological father. Authorities later determined that Floyd had no legal custody rights over the children. Nevertheless, he removed Suzanne and several of her siblings from foster care and disappeared. In the years that followed, Suzanne's siblings were eventually located through separate circumstances. Suzanne was not. She vanished into Floyd's world. The limitations of child welfare systems during the 1970s made the search extraordinarily difficult. There were no nationwide computerized databases linking missing child investigations. Communication between agencies was often slow. Floyd exploited those weaknesses, moving frequently and adopting new identities whenever necessary. Each relocation erased another part of Suzanne's past. She attended different schools under different names. She lived in multiple states. Whenever questions arose, Floyd simply moved again. By the time Suzanne reached adulthood, almost every official record connected to her true identity had disappeared. Former classmates and teachers helped investigators reconstruct those missing years. They remembered a bright, respectful student who excelled academically. She earned excellent grades and showed remarkable intelligence, yet she rarely discussed her family. She never invited classmates home. She avoided conversations about her childhood. Looking back, those who knew her realized they had mistaken secrecy for shyness. In reality, Suzanne had been living beneath a carefully manufactured identity. The DNA evidence had accomplished something investigators once believed impossible. It had restored the name Franklin Delano Floyd had spent decades trying to erase. Suzanne was no longer an unidentified victim. She was once again a daughter, a sister, a mother. For her surviving family, the discovery brought both relief and heartbreak. For years, they had wondered whether Suzanne might still be alive somewhere. Now they finally knew. She had survived childhood. She had become a young woman. She had built a life under a false name. She had devoted herself to raising her son. And she had died before anyone could tell her that her real family had never stopped searching. Despite this extraordinary breakthrough, one devastating mystery remained. Michael Hughes was still missing. Years of searching had produced no confirmed sightings after the day Floyd abducted him from his elementary school. Although investigators would later secure convictions against Floyd for Michael's kidnapping and for causing the child's death, Michael's body has never been recovered. His disappearance remains one of the most heartbreaking, unresolved aspects of the case. With Suzanne's identity finally restored, investigators had uncovered the truth about the child Franklin Delano Floyd had stolen in 1975. What remained was to understand the life she had been forced to live after that disappearance. Only then could the full scope of Floyd's crimes and Suzanne Marie Sevakis' extraordinary resilience be fully understood. With the DNA evidence finally confirming her identity, investigators were no longer searching for an unknown woman. They were telling the story of Suzanne Marie Sevakis, For more than 20 years, she had lived under names that were never her own. Now, piece by piece, the life that had been stolen from her began to reappear. Suzanne was born in 1969. She spent her earliest years with her mother, Sandra Wilcox, and her siblings. Like many families facing financial hardship, life was not always easy, but Suzanne was surrounded by brothers and sisters who would later remember her as a cheerful, energetic little girl. Those memories would become some of the only surviving glimpses of the childhood she was destined to lose. In 1975, everything changed. After Sandra Wilcox served a short prison sentence for a financial offense, her children were placed in foster care while the legal process unfolded. It was intended to be a temporary arrangement. Before Sandra could reclaim them, Franklin Delano Floyd appeared. Claiming to be the children's father, Floyd took Suzanne and several of her siblings from foster care. Authorities later determined that he had no legal right to do so. Within a short time, he disappeared. The search for the missing children became increasingly difficult. This was decades before computerized child protection databases, nationwide missing child alerts, and instant communication between law enforcement agencies. Records remained scattered across different jurisdictions. Critical information often traveled slowly. Floyd exploited those weaknesses. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they found that Suzanne's siblings were eventually recovered through separate circumstances. Suzanne was not. She remained with Floyd. From that point forward, her childhood effectively vanished from official records. As Floyd moved from state to state, Suzanne was given new names. Each move erased another part of her identity. She attended different schools. She lived in different communities. Whenever questions became uncomfortable, Floyd simply relocated and started over. To neighbors, they appeared to be an ordinary father and daughter. No one knew the truth. Former classmates described Suzanne as bright and academically gifted. She earned good grades. Teachers remembered her as respectful and eager to learn. She was artistic, enjoyed reading, and often impressed those around her with her intelligence. Yet there was always an unmistakable sadness. She rarely spoke about her family. She avoided discussing her past. Friends noticed that she seemed isolated from other students, often leaving school immediately after classes ended. Looking back, many realized they had mistaken her silence for shyness. In reality, Suzanne had been living under extraordinary control. As she entered her teenage years, the nature of Floyd's deception changed. For years, he had introduced Suzanne as his daughter. Then, without explanation, he began introducing her as his wife. To people who had only recently met them, nothing seemed unusual. They assumed they were simply a married couple with a significant age difference. Only later did investigators understand the disturbing reality. The young woman Floyd claimed was his wife was the same child he had once claimed was his daughter. During the investigation, evidence and witness testimony established that Floyd had subjected Suzanne to years of severe exploitation. Investigators also concluded that Michael, the little boy Suzanne loved so deeply, had been born during that period of exploitation. DNA testing later confirmed that Franklin Delano Floyd was not Michael's biological father, but the identity of Michael's biological father has never been publicly established. The exact circumstances surrounding Michael's conception remain one of the unanswered aspects of the case. Despite everything she endured, Suzanne fought to create as normal a life as possible. Friends in Oklahoma remembered her determination to provide a better future for Michael. She worked long hours. She cared for her son with remarkable devotion. She spoke about wanting him to have opportunities she had never experienced. Those who knew her often remarked on the contrast between her gentle nature and the controlling behavior of the man who claimed to be her husband. Many believed she wanted to leave. Several friends later recalled conversations in which Suzanne hinted at starting over somewhere else. Some remembered her expressing hope that one day she and Michael could build a different life. Whether she had begun making plans to leave remains unknown. She died before she ever had the chance to tell her own story. The hit-and-run collision in Oklahoma ended Suzanne's life at just 20 years old. For decades afterward, she was remembered only by a false name. The world mourned Tanya Hughes. No one knew they were actually mourning Suzanne Marie Sevakis. When investigators finally contacted Suzanne's surviving family after the DNA identification, emotions were overwhelming. Her siblings had spent years wondering what had become of their sister. Some had searched for her. Others had feared they would never know the truth. Now, after more than 2 decades, they finally learned what had happened. The little girl taken from foster care had survived. She had grown into a compassionate young woman. She had become a mother, and she had died without ever recovering the identity that had been taken from her as a child. Restoring Suzanne's name was one of the investigation's greatest achievements. It gave dignity back to a victim whose entire life had been shaped by another person's actions. But one devastating mystery remained unresolved. Suzanne's son, Michael, was still missing. Franklin Delano Floyd remained the only person who knew exactly what had happened after the boy was taken in 1994. And despite years of questioning, he continued to withhold the answers that investigators and Suzanne's family desperately sought. By the time Suzanne Marie Sevakis had finally been identified, one heartbreaking mystery still overshadowed every breakthrough. Where was Michael? For investigators, restoring Suzanne's identity had answered a question that had lingered for decades, but it also renewed their determination to find the little boy she had loved so deeply. Michael Hughes disappeared on September 12, 1994. He was 6 years old. The incident took place in broad daylight outside his elementary school in Choctaw, Oklahoma. Witnesses watched helplessly as Franklin Delano Floyd compelled the child into a vehicle while displaying a firearm before driving away. 11 days later, federal agents arrested Floyd in Louisville, Kentucky. Michael was nowhere to be found. Find the child. The search expanded across multiple states. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, local law enforcement agencies, and federal prosecutors worked together, reviewing every possible lead. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Travel routes were reconstructed. Receipts, motel records, fuel purchases, and telephone records were examined in an effort to trace Floyd's movements after the kidnapping. Search teams explored rural properties. Lakes and wooded areas were examined. Excavation crews investigated locations identified through witness tips. Cadaver dogs were deployed during several searches. Each new lead brought hope. Each ended in disappointment. As investigators questioned Floyd over the years, they found themselves confronting a man who treated the search as another opportunity for manipulation. He rarely gave the same account twice. Sometimes he claimed Michael had been left with a church. On other occasions, he suggested the boy had been placed with a family that wanted children. In different interviews, he implied that Michael was still alive somewhere under another identity. Every version was investigated. None could be verified. The contradictions only strengthened investigators' belief that Floyd was intentionally concealing the truth. Federal prosecutors continued building their case. Although Michael's body had never been recovered, the evidence surrounding the abduction became increasingly compelling. Witnesses had seen Floyd kidnap the child. No verified sightings of Michael occurred after that day. Floyd could offer no credible explanation for the boy's disappearance. In 1997, Floyd was convicted in federal court for kidnapping Michael Hughes. Years later, additional federal proceedings addressed what investigators believed had happened after the abduction. In 2015, Floyd was convicted of causing Michael's death during the kidnapping, despite the fact that Michael's body has never been found. The prosecution relied on extensive circumstantial evidence demonstrating that Michael had disappeared while under Floyd's exclusive control and had never been seen again. Even after the conviction, investigators did not stop searching. Law enforcement agencies continued to appeal to the public for information. Age-progressed images of Michael were distributed for years in the hope that he might somehow have survived. Every credible tip was examined. Every reported sighting received attention. The possibility, however remote, could not be ignored. Families of missing children understand a painful truth. Without definitive evidence, hope can endure for years. For Suzanne's surviving relatives, Michael represented the last living connection to the young woman they had only recently found again. They wanted answers not only for themselves, but for Suzanne. She had spent the final years of her life protecting her son. Now both mother and child had become victims of the same man. Investigators came to believe that Floyd viewed Michael not as a child with his own future, but as someone he could control completely. When the courts removed Michael from his custody, Floyd appeared unwilling to accept that loss. The schoolyard abduction was not a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of his determination to regain control over the only person Suzanne had left behind. Despite decades of investigation, one crucial piece of the story remains missing. Franklin Delano Floyd has never provided a truthful account of Michael's fate. He has refused to reveal where the boy was taken after the kidnapping or where investigators might find his remains. As a result, Michael Hughes remains officially listed as missing. His case is one of the most heartbreaking unresolved child disappearances in modern American criminal history. For investigators, the search for Michael became about more than solving another crime. It became an effort to restore dignity to a little boy whose life had been overshadowed by deception from the very beginning. He had grown up under a false family history. He had lost his mother at the age of 4, he had been abducted at 6, and then he vanished. Although many questions surrounding Suzanne Sevakis were finally answered through years of determined investigative work, Michael's story remains incomplete. His disappearance stands as the final chapter in Franklin Delano Floyd's long history of manipulation and violence, a reminder that even after decades of investigation, some victims are still waiting to be brought home. As the case drew to a close, investigators reflected on everything they had uncovered: a stolen childhood, a fabricated identity, a young mother's tragic death, and a missing little boy whose fate remains unknown. It was a story unlike any other in American criminal history, one that demonstrated how a single individual, through years of deception and abuse, had managed to erase identities, destroy families, and leave generations searching for the truth. Justice did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, piece by piece. One investigation led to another. One false identity uncovered another hidden crime. Each breakthrough revealed how deeply Franklin Delano Floyd had manipulated the lives of those around him. For investigators, the case became a testament to persistence. What began as a routine fatal traffic investigation in Oklahoma had evolved into one of the most extraordinary criminal investigations in modern American history. It had taken more than 2 decades to identify the woman known as Tanya Hughes. It had taken years to expose the man who called himself Clarence Hughes, and even after countless interviews, forensic examinations, and court proceedings, some questions would never be fully answered. Franklin Delano Floyd spent the remainder of his life behind bars. Over the years, he was convicted in both state and federal courts for numerous crimes connected to the case. His convictions included kidnapping Michael Hughes in 1994 and years later causing the child's death during that kidnapping, despite the fact that Michael's body has never been recovered. The federal jury concluded that the evidence proved Michael did not survive the abduction. Floyd received multiple life sentences. He would never again live as a free man. Even in prison, investigators continued trying to obtain the truth. Detectives interviewed Floyd repeatedly, hoping that age or time might persuade him to reveal what had happened to Michael. He never did. Instead, he continued offering contradictory accounts. Sometimes he claimed Michael had been left safely with strangers. Other times he refused to answer questions altogether. None of his explanations were supported by evidence. To the end of his life, Floyd remained the only person known to possess the complete truth about Michael's disappearance. He died in prison in 2023 at the age of 79. With his death, investigators lost their last direct opportunity to learn what happened after the schoolyard kidnapping in 1994. For Michael's loved ones, Floyd's death brought no real sense of closure. The most important answer had died with him. Yet the investigation achieved something equally significant. It restored Suzanne Marie Sevakis to history. For more than 20 years, she had existed only under a stolen identity. She had lived as Sharon Marshall. She had later been known as Tanya Hughes. Only through decades of determined investigative work and advances in DNA analysis was her real name finally returned to her. Today, Suzanne is remembered not merely as a victim, but as a remarkable young woman whose intelligence, resilience, and compassion endured despite years of unimaginable abuse. Former classmates continue to remember her as one of the brightest students they had ever known. Friends remember her devotion to Michael. Family members remember the little girl who disappeared in 1975 and was finally brought home, at least in name, many years later. The case also changed the way many investigators viewed missing person investigations. It demonstrated the extraordinary value of forensic genealogy and DNA technology in identifying victims whose identities had been deliberately concealed. It showed how cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies could unravel crimes spanning decades and multiple jurisdictions. Most importantly, it reminded investigators never to dismiss inconsistencies that seemed too unusual to explain. A missing school record, a false name, a contradictory statement. Any one of those details might appear insignificant on its own. Together, they exposed a lifetime of deception. The story of Girl in the Picture is not simply the story of a hit-and-run victim. It is the story of a child whose identity was stolen. A brilliant young woman who survived years of abuse while trying to create a better life for her son. A little boy whose disappearance continues to haunt investigators. And a criminal who spent decades hiding behind lies until the truth finally caught up with him. Although many mysteries surrounding Suzanne Sevakis have now been solved, one remains. Michael Hughes has never been found. His case is still officially unresolved. Law enforcement agencies continue to encourage anyone with credible information about his disappearance to come forward, however much time has passed. For Suzanne's family and for everyone who worked the case, the hope has never been to rewrite the past. That is impossible. The hope has always been simpler. To restore names that were stolen, to give victims back their identities, to tell the truth as completely as the evidence allows. Because every victim deserves to be known, every child deserves to be remembered, and every life hidden beneath deception deserves to be brought back into the light. The investigation into Girl in the Picture proved that while lies can survive for decades, they do not always survive forever. Sometimes the smallest unanswered question becomes the beginning of the truth. Sometimes a forgotten photograph leads investigators back to a missing child, and sometimes justice is measured not only by convictions in a courtroom, but by the restoration of a name that the world was never meant to forget. Suzanne Marie Sevakis was never truly the girl in the picture. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother. And after decades of silence, the world finally learned who she really was. Some criminal cases end with a confession, others end with a conviction. The story of Girl in the Picture ended with something far more complicated. Franklin Delano Floyd spent the rest of his life in prison, convicted of numerous crimes connected to Suzanne Sevakis and Michael Hughes. Yet he never fully explained what he had done. He never gave investigators a complete account of Suzanne's stolen childhood. He never revealed the fate of Michael. And he never offered the families he shattered the answers they had searched for over decades. When Floyd died in prison in 2023, many believed the last opportunity to learn the complete truth died with him. But his silence did not erase the evidence. It did not erase Suzanne's identity. And it did not erase the determination of the investigators who refused to let an unidentified young woman remain forgotten. Through years of patient investigative work, witness interviews, court records, and advances in forensic DNA analysis, the woman once known only as Tanya Hughes was finally restored to her true name, Suzanne Marie Sevakis. That achievement mattered, because identity is more than a name on a document. It is family, it is history, it is the life that existed before someone tried to erase it. Suzanne's story is now told not simply as that of a victim, but as a young woman whose intelligence, kindness, and resilience survived years of manipulation and abuse. Those who knew her remembered her as someone who cared deeply for her son and worked tirelessly to give him a better future, even while living under circumstances few could imagine. Yet one chapter remains unfinished. Michael Hughes has never been found. Although Franklin Delano Floyd was convicted in connection with Michael's kidnapping and death, the little boy's remains have never been recovered, and his disappearance continues to leave an unanswered question at the heart of this case. For Suzanne's surviving family, justice has always been incomplete. They regained a sister's name. They learned what became of the little girl taken from them in 1975, but they never had the chance to know the woman she became, nor have they been able to lay Michael to rest. The legacy of Girl in the Picture reaches beyond a single criminal investigation. It exposed weaknesses in child protection systems during the 1970s, demonstrated the extraordinary value of modern forensic science in solving long-unsolved cases, and showed how persistence can uncover truths that once seemed permanently lost. Most of all, it serves as a reminder that behind every cold case file is a human life, a child who once laughed, a family that never stopped wondering, a victim whose story deserves to be told accurately and with dignity. More than 3 decades after Suzanne's death, and decades after her disappearance as a child, the investigation transformed her from an unidentified victim into someone the world could finally know by her real name. Her photograph is no longer simply a mystery, it is a reminder of a life that was stolen but not forgotten. And although some answers may never come, Suzanne Marie Sevakis is no longer the girl nobody knew. She has her name back. She has her place in history. And through the determination of investigators, journalists, and her surviving family, her story will continue to be remembered, not for the lies that surrounded her, but for the truth that finally emerged.